When founders talk about scaling a company, they usually talk about products, customers, capital, revenue. But the companies that actually survive and scale face a different problem: culture. And when companies grow quickly or grow through acquisitions, culture becomes even more fragile. In fact, 42% of deal makers say integration challenges and post-transaction execution risks have caused them to walk away from potential acquisitions entirely. In other words, the problem isn't the deal, it's what happens after the deal. And more often than not, the thing that breaks first isn't the technology or the strategy, it's the culture. So, how do you scale culture intentionally? How do you grow a company from 3 to hundreds through pivots, acquisitions, massive business model transformations without losing the thing that made the company work in the first place? I'm Tom Chavez, and today I'm joined by George Schlossnagle, tech partner at Rally Venutres. George is the founder of Message Systems, the email infrastructure company that evolved into SparkPost and was ultimately sold to MessageBird for $600 million. Along the way, George led the company through multiple transformations, all while deliberately engineering the company's culture to scale along the business. Today, we're going to unpack why culture can't be left to chance, how founders accumulate culture debt without even knowing it, and what it actually takes to build organizations that survive growth and acquisitions.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here. Yeah, I think it starts with valuing culture as a concept and and an artifact within a business. I think particularly for engineers, it can be very easy, I think, to dismiss the importance of culture. I think especially when you look at highfalutin value statements or culture statements, it's very easy to look at those things and say, "Hey, that's a bunch of fluff," and dismiss the whole category. And while I do think, I'm also an engineer by training and profession. It 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 is easy to look at some of those things and think, well, there's a lot of shine on this object. Um, it's still really important, and it's really important because culture guides everything that you do, especially when you're not personally watching, right? So culture is the guidebook for when the explicit instructions on what you're supposed to do fail. It's how you keep everybody aligned and ensure that the business is executing um, how you want it to execute, not just in the direction that you want it to execute. Hmm. Right. Hmm. Um, I, I think it's. I mean, personally, I think it's just a intrinsic part of human nature. I think a lot of times people are very eager to please. It's very easy to get, I guess, sort of like procedural buy-in on a statement. Hey, we should act like this. Yeah, that makes sense. Everybody should act like that. But then actually behaving in that manner and executing, in a way that's consistent with whatever the culture of the business happens to be. And obviously, there's tons of different cultures that work. They're very successful businesses with radically different cultures. But I think that the important part is that within the business, they have good cultural coherency so that people can understand when I interact with someone, how's it going to go? When I'm left unobserved, what should I do? Um, and so I just think that I think it's important, and it's just I think it's very easy to pay lip service to things, which is why it's really important to be very intentional about it and to really follow up on it, because otherwise it's easy to right it's easy just to pay lip service to something and to carry on without actually validating that it was true. You're very similar to anything within engineering, right? So you can set yourself out goals, but if you don't measure those goals and hold yourself accountable to them, then it doesn't really matter, right? You can say, hey, we aspire to have 5 nines of uptime, but if you don't measure it, then who the hell knows what your uptime is? I think the same thing goes with cultural values. If you don't set them out explicitly and then monitor them and hold yourself accountable to them, who knows what's going on. Mhm. Yeah, honestly, I think a lot of it happened prior to becoming an engineer. So when I was in graduate school, I took a sabbatical. I was in the Peace Corps for 2.5 years. Worked and lived in Nepal, which super poor country that has a lot of challenges. And one of the most important lessons that I learned out of that is how to um, how to achieve your goals through influence, right? In the sense of how do you work with people to ensure that everybody really understands what you're trying to do, that everybody is aligned towards it, and that you can achieve that when you're in a position where you really don't have that much like command authority. And I think that was a really important lesson, because I think it's within business, it's very easy to overestimate the amount of like actual true command authority that you have, right? So like as a CEO, ostensibly people should do what you say, but in reality, unless you want your entire life to be micromanaging people, which itself is not a very effective management strategy, you really need to learn how to motivate people to go out and execute on common goals on their own without supervision. And so I think that those two things are pretty similar. I think a secondary lesson that I learned in terms of the importance of monitoring that was, as we expanded into multiple geographic locations, right? So, like many companies, we effectively started in a basement, and then we grew into a small office, and eventually we opened up a West Coast office. We were East Coast based, DC area company, and one of the things that we would start to notice over time is you get cultural drift between offices, right? So you show up at your Redwood City office, and something happens. Just the way people work or is maybe different than at home, and then you start hearing like, oh well, I mean that's not the way we do things here, which to me is a huge red flag pointing to cultural misalignment, right? And sometimes those things can be benign, but oftentimes what it indicates is that you have a different culture forming within a different part of the company, for very natural reasons, because they're separated by time and space. But it makes it difficult to get everybody aligned and move in the same direction. Yeah. So the thing that I just talked about, I think, is a great example of that, right? So to me, culture debt, much like technical debt, is when you make a set of decisions, and you usually don't fully anticipate the ramifications of those. And then they get built into, in the case of technical debt, into the way that your products operate. In case of culture debt, into how your company operates, right? And much like technical debt, which is hard to reverse because now all of a sudden, what started as, maybe one small library, like affecting one component of your code, is now like, right? Like it's broadly spread. It's in a number of different components, a number of different systems, and the act of touching a thing can potentially break an enormous amount of stuff, right? So there's a lot of effort that goes into reversing it or containing it. I think culture debt exists in the same way, right? So if you, for instance, have a second office and you don't really pay attention to how the culture is developing there, and it ends up moving in a way that's not well aligned with the business as a whole, then the longer that goes on, the harder it is to reverse, because now you have an entire set of people who have been brought up within the company inside that little cultural bubble, which means that it's not just the people who caused that change, but it's kind of everybody that grew up within the business within that culture. And I think that one of the things that's also really uh, was surprising to me was the degree to which many employees like really embrace the culture of a business. Um, Kind of regardless of what it is. I think you will have a number of people who become really true believers, maybe even more so than you as the person who set out to create that culture with intentionality. And so the challenge that comes with that is that if you need to change it, now you have a whole subset of people who feel like their core values, what they've come to believe the company is about, is false or is being changed, and it's really uncomfortable for them, and so it can be very difficult to reverse. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the great question. So I think that the drift happens somewhat naturally, right? And I think that it happens when you aren't really super intentional about how you want um, how you want the culture to work within an organization. Like a great example would be transparency within an organization, open door policy, the degree to which employees have latitude in choosing how to execute their tasks. I think some of those things are to me can be like fundamental aspects of culture, and different people have different views on them, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I think yes, yes. There were leaders in the other office. You can't really have an office without leaders, and especially if you have people gathering together, whether or not you intend for there to be a leader, there will be leaders. It's just a natural emergent tendency within groups. Um, and so if you're not super intentional about how you want certain things to operate, the things that are important to you, then again, back to different organizations can have different successful organizations can have radically different cultures. You right, like some leaders who are excellent leaders without cultural guidance will default to implementing some sort of culture because like culture will always exist, whether or not you create it. So if you're not intentional about it, it'll just evolve in whatever's natural for the people that are creating it, and it's a recipe for misalignment. Um, Yeah, and I mean, the way that certainly I observed it is a little bit like I described, right? So visiting an office, which maybe not doing as often as I should, right? So you go, you talk to people, and then you just start observing behavior. And it's not necessarily that a thing is bad or wrong. It's just different than the way that in my case, the company that I created, I wanted to operate, right? So to me, transparency is really important. To me, being super honest with not only like your peers but your customers is also really important. Big believer in almost radical transparency. Not everybody believes that. Not every organization believes in that, and that can be okay unless like that's an important element of your culture, in which case deviance from that is not okay. Yeah, so I work with a number of different VC and PE firms, with portfolio companies. I think that one of the most common issues is hiring for technical capability without really valuing, or paying attention to how someone is a cultural fit within the organization. Um, and I think it can be problematic, um, and they're equally important, right? So that's the biggest mistake, right? Like, hey, this person is. I mean, one of the classic examples within engineering is hiring the 10x engineer who's a real toxic POS, and not recognizing that, like, in almost all circumstances, certainly as your organization grows, that becomes really difficult to manage and it ends up being a net negative for the organization. But that type of thing exists everywhere, and a key element to that as well is, um, understanding that it's just as important in the parts of the organization that maybe you don't personally understand, as it is in the ones that you do. I think, again, for technical founders, it can be pretty easy to look at maybe certain other customer facing roles as being, kind of like fundamentally different, and like behaving by different rules. And I don't think that that's true. Certainly not from like a cultural perspective, right? It's really important to have good alignment because everybody serves a role in the business. We all need to operate as a team, um, and if you don't have alignment on values, it's very difficult to do that. Yep. Yes. Absolutely. That's And how does it affect your ability to grow that team? How does it affect the reliability of whatever it is that they work on? There is no world in which a single person is the solution to everything. Eventually, that person will leave, or they'll get disinterested, or it will outgrow the scope of what they're able to do. But if they've created a toxic bubble around themselves where no one else can or wants to touch it, then all of a sudden you're in a really vulnerable position. So it's rough, and I think that that same personality exists in other parts of the business as well, and much as I think that I don't know. I feel like there's a cliche where you have like a non-technical founder who puts false value on the 10x engineer, right? Like, oh, we've got this guy, he's brilliant. He built the whole system, he owns the whole system, and I think as engineers, we can recognize all the falsehoods in that. That same paradigm exists with other roles as well. I mean, you see the same thing with people in sales, with all sorts of other functions, and you just have to be careful that you don't invert the whole thing and say like, oh yeah, I can spot toxic engineers, but like, oh hey, that person that runs our sales organization, yeah, they're super abrasive, but like, man, they close deals. It's like, yeah, but what's the cost of the deals that they close? Do they oversell the capabilities of the company, put a huge tax on your engineering team, pull your product team off of priorities to fulfill the things that they sold? That potential for like non-team player toxic individual to cause damage really exists, I think, in every role within a business. Thank you. It's a really hard question. In that particular example, I actually don't know if we did the world's greatest job in that case. I think one of the challenges that we had is that we exited at the beginning of 2021 when there was a lot going on in the world at that time. So we had a pretty unique transaction in the sense that we had a partnership with Bird predating the relationship, so it wasn't a brand new relationship. But in the course of the deal, we actually never met in person because of travel restrictions and what have you with COVID. And so it was really it was difficult, I think, to really evaluate that in the way that you would like to. Um, I know when we acquired, so we acquired a couple different businesses prior to our own acquisition. I know when, for instance, we acquired eData Source, we spent a tremendous amount of time going out, meeting with the team, meeting with all the individuals, and really trying to understand, is this gonna work out, right? Because we're not simply buying technology. We also, we need the team that built it, not only to maintain it, but also to help integrate it and grow it as a business. And so that was very, very important to us. I think one of the things that I'm most proud of with the acquisitions that we did was not only the way that we were able to really transform the revenue derived from those products, right, to get really good value arbitrage on the deal, but the really solid retention and continued growth of people within those organizations within the new organization. And I think that that's, again, like, not really good at self congratulations, but I think to me that's a sign of a really good acquisition when not only are you successful with the product and the business that you bought, but that those individuals that come over as part of the transaction, you have a large number of them continue on with the business and grow into roles within the new mothership, not just within their own siloed compartment. Yeah, I think there are a couple. One is one I mentioned before. I think when you start when you start having like a real nexus of people that exist in places where you are not, that can be a real hard thing. Again, most of my experience with that kind of predates the world being as virtual as it is today. But I do think to the extent that you do have like true nexuses of people, right? Where you have like, a dozen people or 20 people in a city, something like that, you will get a cultural bubble one way or another, right? Because people like to meet with their hopefully people like to meet with their coworkers, become friends with them, and so there's a real potential for that. That will develop. There will be a culture that develops there, whether or not you help guide it or not. And if you don't do it, then you're leaving yourself up to the whims of fate. So that's one. I think that the one of the other real key moments in the growth of a business is the place where you go from knowing every single individual in the company, knowing their name, knowing, who their spouse is, knowing whether or not they have kids, a little bit of what their interests are, to no longer being able to do that for everyone within the business. And I know for me that happened probably around 100 people, where you go from really knowing everybody to like, I know your name, you know, um, but maybe you don't know really like all the like you're no longer in a place where you can sit down and have an informed like lunch conversation about that person, their family, and how it's changed since the last time you talked with them. And I think that's it's a natural part, like whether or not that happens at 100 people or 200 people, like eventually it will happen to everyone because we only have so much brain space. But it's also really important in being a good steward of the culture. Like that's the place where your culture really needs to work, right? Because now you can no longer personally shepherd that. Now you need help doing that. Now you need the people who do know, right? So now you have a collection of people who knows everything about all the important things about everyone. You need all of those people minimally aligned for your culture to remain consistent. And if you don't have that, then you will start having culture branching. It's just, I think, a matter of fact. All right, I'll do my best. That's not the way we do things here. I think hiring toxic people, and I'll augment that with promoting toxic people, or people that promoting people past their capabilities as some sort of retention or reward, that they're important. Um, be intentional and authentic, and really ensure that the group around you, right, your executive team, is really well aligned on these things and believes in them, and then things will promulgate. Thanks, Tom. It was a real pleasure.